So we're back in Google Scholar. We've got all of our papers that we want to read. You've found links to PDFs for some of them. You've downloaded them. Your stack of papers to read is like this thick, and you're wondering how on earth you're possibly going to read all these things. Don't read them like you would a novel. Right? This is a very targeted kind of reading. So just like you wouldn't read an encyclopedia from cover to cover, you wouldn't read a research paper from beginning to end like that. A research paper usually has a very well-defined structure, much like an encyclopedia or a dictionary, that helps you just target exactly what it is that you need to get out of every paper. This is how I read a stack of research papers. The first thing I do is read the abstracts. Right, so that's going to be the little paragraph in the very top that summarizes a particular paper. It kind of tells you everything that they did about it. So here's the abstract. This is, again, just a one-paragraph summary of the research question, why it's important, the particular approach they took, and then the conclusions, like what did they find. And a lot of times, that's like 90% of what you need. So I would read a paper and understand the abstracts, maybe even cut out the abstracts into little index cards or something, and try to sort them into different piles. Do you find that there's a group of papers that argues that telecommunications and growth are unrelated? Make a pile of index cards for those papers. And then another group that says they are related, make that into a separate pile. And then dig in within those piles. So of the group that says that they're related, maybe one group says telecom causes growth. And the other group says, no, if you're already rich, you can afford a nice telecommunications system. So the causality distinguishes different clusters of papers. And it's up to you to understand all those 20 papers as abstracts well enough that you can kind of categorize them. So your main job here is just to get a passing familiarity with the papers and then do an outline of how they're related to each other. You haven't required a whole lot of reading, just a paragraph or two per paper, but it does require you to really think deeply about the connections between the papers, and that's not easy, so don't disregard that part of the project. The next thing is now you're going to start going through a second reading. So now you've got to start digging deep. All right, so you read the abstract. The introduction usually will tell you why a paper is important, what the research issues are, and why you should keep reading. You should read that part. And then you should get through to their own literature reviews. Okay, skim that part. Then jump to the end of the paper. All right, so we go through a whole bunch of details, but towards the end of the paper will be some conclusions. Conclusions right there. So that's itself a kind of summary. What the authors will do there is tell you, all right, we had a research question. We had data from here. We looked at it in a particular way, and you'll quickly describe the way that they looked at it. And then they'll go through all of their conclusions. A good conclusion will also tie those conclusions back to the relevant literature. So you'll say something like, we find that telecommunications causes growth. Therefore, all these other scholars that thought there was no relationship, they're wrong. And also, those scholars that thought that income causes telecom, they were wrong. Or maybe you verified something, or maybe your results are ambiguous. That's all going to come out in the conclusions. Read all the intros and conclusions for every one of those papers, and you'll start being able to flesh out that outline that you were preparing. So now you get a slightly deeper understanding of those papers. On a third reading, now we get even more nitty-gritty, right? So now we read the literature reviews a little bit more carefully. By the way, a literature review is a perfect place for you to get information on what should be in your own literature review. So if you find that everybody cites, this paper by Islam on economic growth, or Barrow and Levine and Rinelt on economic growth, hey, Datta and Agarwal, there it is, right? Datta and Agarwal. If everyone is citing those papers, you should cite them too. And this will also help you understand those papers better because another scholar has read them. So you go through the literature review, you're seeing what you missed, and then they start explaining what their research methodology is. Now, you will eventually need to know this because you're going to have to collect data and you're going to have to crunch your own numbers too. When it's time to do that for your own paper, that's when it's time to read this part of all of those 20 or 30 other research papers. So you want to see, what do Barrow do? What does Barrow do? What does Levine and Rinelt do? What did Levendis and Lee and Gutierrez do? They did something very similar to these guys. They estimated a regression equation or a system that looked like this. And so maybe you should do the same thing as well. Thing is, these are all very technical details, right? So this is like details that you would need if you were trying to replicate their paper. You're probably not trying to replicate exactly a paper. What you're trying to do is understand the paper. So for a lot of research papers, this is not terribly relevant to you, right? The data. When it's time for you to collect your own data, go back to these papers and see, where did they get their data from? Is there a data set that's really good that everybody uses? Is it better than the one that you thought you were going to use? You could get that out of these papers. But during the literature review stage, you don't really need to know this. When it gets time to like writing up your data section and crunching numbers, that's when this becomes relevant. So they've calculated their results. They explained their results and what they found in nice tables. Point here, though, is that when you read a paper, you read the sections of the paper that are important to you for where you are in your own research process. If you're just trying to understand the terrain, you're reading the abstracts. If you're trying to understand about the literature and how it relates, then you start reading the literature review. Right? And I mentioned abstracts, read the intro and conclusion as well. When you're writing your literature review, read their literature reviews. When you're starting to do your data collection, read the data collection portions of these papers. When you're starting to analyze your data, that's when you go into the data analysis sections of these papers. So notice you're not reading from first word to last word. You're being very targeted, reading the sections that are important to you. That's how scholars get through reading dozens and dozens of research papers. They only read the parts that they need when they need it. So hopefully that takes some of the mystery out of the research process and helps you in your own kind of endeavors. Thanks for listening, and see you later.